proud of this country. You only got to take us out of our country, and it's not long until we start longing for being home. When Indigenous people are successful, the whole nation progresses as well. The welcome to country is really a beautiful thing that non-Aboriginal can say, hey, I live on country. I not only live in the country of Australia, but I live on country. There's a lot of fatigue amongst our Indigenous community. There is frustration and there's disappointment. If you look at the politicians who are trying to make it into a political situation, they have sat through numerous welcome to countries, our acknowledgements of countries, respectfully, but all of a sudden, because it's an election, then it's something that can be leveraged to build a profile to gain votes. It's not for the Aboriginal people to keep educating and to keep telling and keep reminding.
Thanks for joining us, Darren. What is NAIDOC Week like? Can you give us a bit of background and why it's significant?
Yeah, look, NAIDOC Week is a significant time for Australia. It identifies a week of celebrating Indigenous culture, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, their achievements and their contribution to the nation. And so NAIDOC is all about that. And its history is one it's come from the people themselves. As far back as probably the 1920s, you've got people that came together, understood that they were living in a society that they were faced with restrictions and limited opportunities, and they looked at ways of how can we boost the morale, the understanding of their own culture and their presence. And so it became a time of celebration, celebrating some of the achievements and their existence. And NAIDOC is really all about that. And it's continued on to modern day. And it continues to highlight the successes that we have in our community. And NAIDOC is an invitation for all Australia, because when Indigenous people are successful and progress, the whole nation progresses as well. So it's a celebration of our nationhood together. And so it's a good thing for the community, a good thing for our society.
Can you give us a window into what that success looks like and what NAIDOC actually entails in the modern day? What is NAIDOC? What are some of the events that take place? What do some of those successes look like?
In the modern day NAIDOC celebration, they'll have the NAIDOC Awards, where they recognise the achievements of people in the community. It may be the Elder of the Year. It may be people delivering services to the community, personal achievements of individuals and sporting achievements, whatever it may be. We normally associate Indigenous achievements with sports. That's in the general Australian context. But NAIDOC is much more broader than that. It looks at a whole range of categories, and so they'll have an evening where they celebrate and give those awards. And so we see that happening, and that's on a national scale, but it's also in different states. They do their own, and so it does give opportunity for people in the local communities to be recognised and to be celebrated. And even stories come out of those celebrations that we may not hear about or have heard news about. I think of some of the ranger programs where Indigenous rangers are preserving rare species and habitats that we have in Australia. And this is a significant achievement for our people, but also for our country. We've got so many interesting and wonderful sort of creatures and habitats where these animals live, and yet it's our people who understand them and know them and is now caring for those habitats. So that's, in the modern day, that's the big success stories of those kinds of things happening. And then you've got other young people who are becoming doctors and so on, and working in the legal field, and it's really mainstreaming Indigenous people in Australian society. Not assimilating them, but mainstreaming them so that they're still Aboriginal, they're still connected to their people, but they're achieving on the same level as anybody else in this country. So that's quite significant.
The theme for 2025 is the next generation, strength, vision, and legacy. What does that theme mean to you when you hear it?
Yeah, certainly it highlights that the next generation is a group of people, young people, who are passionate, who are grounded, who are connected, who also understand the historical context that the previous generations have come through. A lot of aspects of life will be in their hands as we move forward. And we see a lot of trailblazers who've done some very hard yards in our Aboriginal community who are getting to the end where age is catching up to them and they're looking at passing on to the next generation. And so we're seeing that happen. And we're seeing a lot more young people get involved and being involved and confident in what they can do. And so that is really what this next generation is all about. And transferring that information, transferring that hope, and looking forward to good outcomes for all Aboriginal people.
You're a pastor, Darren, yourself. Where do you see the Bible speaking to this theme of legacy and empowering the next generation, reflecting on that NAIDOC theme and seeing it in the biblical worldview?
Yeah, certainly the biblical worldview. We've got patterns throughout the Bible. We've got Moses handing over leadership to Joshua. We've got Elijah handing it over to Elisha. And also, even in the gospel stories, you move into the early church, from the disciples to the apostles and so on, and the raising up of the different churches in the various regions. So we see that next generation coming through just as passionate, just as fixed and focused on what the mandate is to share the gospel, to bring hope. And so there's lots of parallels in that. And so as Christians today, we draw strength from that as well. So as an Aboriginal Christian, then what we do in our Aboriginal community is very much in line with what the Bible teaches and what the Bible shows us in the patterns of leadership and development of people and mentoring and so on. Yeah.
Just on touching on that idea of mentoring, I imagine it's a buzzword these days. Mentoring is becoming more important. I think when I was a kid, I didn't really hear about mentoring. It wasn't maybe as intentional as now. How are you seeing that in your own life and ministry? Are you finding it successful? Are you practicing it? Are you seeing it being practiced in Indigenous communities and the broader community that you're part of?
Yeah, actually, I had this conversation last night. Me and my wife, Kathy, were talking about it and just thinking about the whole concept of discipleship, and mentoring is part of that. And it struck me as we were talking, and I said, if we just take the Christian element away from what we're saying, when we talk about discipleship in the Christian context, we're talking about leading people to Jesus and then others leading their friends to Jesus and so on. But when you remove the church aspect to it and you look at the Aboriginal community, discipleship was always there. It was education, it was learning and mentoring. It was all rolled into one. It was a whole community focused and working together to achieve those results. And so we've always had discipling or discipline in our Aboriginal context. And it was done through your uncles. It was done in different stages. Your parents and then your grandparents had a big part of that in your early years. And then as you got older, your aunties and your uncles became part of that and so on. And then your peers. And so you go through all these different stages, but different people are in your life at different times, mentoring and being part of that process. And there's a common thread of what it is that is highlighted within your family. So when I put that together with Christian discipleship, there's no real difference in it other than the fact that Jesus becomes more clearer, and that's our sole purpose, is to share the gospel. But the process of it has always been there with our Aboriginal families. For most Aboriginal families, I should say, not all of them. And that's what's so devastating when it comes to that. When we look at stolen generation and other aspects, removal of children, even in today's society, that's where that breakdown becomes so evident. And it impacts on not on only on the person who was removed, but then those connections that they would normally have with all the family members. So, yeah.
In Proverbs, there's a verse that I quite like. It says, "Without vision, the people perish," basically. And vision is one of the pillars of this NAIDOC theme this year. What do you think should be the vision that Australia has so that our Indigenous people can thrive? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think the vision for Australia is a shared future. And when I say that, I'm thinking of we're all proud of this country. You only got to take us out of our country here and go overseas. And it's not long until we start longing for being home. I was in Los Angeles once and sitting at the hotel window, and I'd been over there for about 2 weeks already, traveling around, and just saw the Qantas plane fly past. I was near the airport, and that just reminded me of home. Straight away, it just took me back to where I needed to be. And so our future together really is a shared one that where we all love our country, we love being in it, but we also need to learn to love who else is in it with us and what that means. We get bogged down on all kinds of things that might divide us, but yet if we looked and a little bit closer at some of those issues, or what they turn into issues, they are actually some really good strong points that could unite us. I think about the whole welcome to country stuff, which is every so often it comes up in a debate and so on. But the welcome to country is really a beautiful thing that non-Aboriginal can take and say, hey, I live on country. I not only live in the country of Australia, that's one thing, and the welcome to country or acknowledgement of country is not about that, but I live on country. That means I live in a place where it has history of Indigenous people who thrived and lived, and they have their storylines here, and there's so much stuff around me. There's a wealth of information around me in nature that tells us that. And that's something that's precious. That's something that's precious in our community. And when we get to that stage where we actually accept that sort of stuff and realize the value of it, then that's walking together with our shared history, and that's the hope for Australia. Because there's no separating. We can't separate. And that old phrase, go back to where you come from, all that doesn't exist anymore. We're all diverse people and we're all in Australia, and yet it can be a beautiful place for all of us. And the same as if I went to live over in Greece or somewhere like that, I would be confronted with what is the history in that place, no matter where I lived, and knowing that people walked those paths a long time before the towns were built or whatever. The history is there. We can accept that history and embrace it, or we can despise it and reject it and forever keep kicking our toe against a rock with it. So that's where we're at with the nation. But my hope is, that we embrace that shared history, and that way we can have a better future together too.
Darren, your work takes you all around Australia, this country, this beautiful country that we live in. What is one thing that really encourages you about the people you meet in your work with ATSIM and all the different tribes and nations and people that you meet, you come across in your travels? What's one thing that's really been encouraging you?
The one thing that many have in common is a strong sense of spirituality. And that means that they believe in a God. They believe that there is something better on the horizon, that God has got a plan for mankind. Without them even understanding all the Bible texts and getting into the depth of all that, they know that already. And so because of that, they live with hope. And that's quite precious when you're out in places where you're looking for a blade of grass, you're looking for those nice swimming North Queensland swimming holes, and with the fresh crystal clear water that we look at and we think is paradise. We go to some very remote places where it's hot and dry, there's more flies than anything, but yet the people have hope, and they have a love for their place, their country there, and it's tied into the spirituality that God is part of them and he's part of that place with them. and but also in the back of their minds, they know that there's a God that's preparing something better for them too. Yeah, that's quite unique that I see, and those kind of discussions come up because you're a religious leader, you're a pastor, but certainly even before you start talking about God, those things come out. So they share that stuff quite openly. They're open about their spirituality.
Mm.
Where
Going back,
there's a contrast.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and because there's a contrast when you come into the cities, that's not as evident, and yet you can have all the resources at your fingertips in the city, but you see a lot of people walking around with no hope. Suicide rates are fairly high, and people are finding themselves really struggling in the towns or regional areas and cities. And there's a longing in people's hearts to go back on country and to do stuff, but also there's a real struggle in the urban areas. Yeah, it probably displays a lot more hopelessness, I think.
Just going back to what you're saying about the controversy around the welcome to country, we've seen
Mm,
some booing and some crowd behavior at different
mm,
events that's brought it into the political sphere, which then it feels like people are making it into a political point scoring
yeah.
exercise.
Mm,
How are Indigenous people feeling at the moment? We're a couple of years past the voice referendum. There's been polarization just in many spheres of life. And as you said, cost of living and things are getting harder. There is
yeah.
a sense of difficulty in just the general Australian
Mm,
society. But how, I know you can't speak for every Indigenous
mm.
person, but how are you sensing that they're feeling at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's tiring. I think there's a lot of fatigue amongst our Indigenous community. There is frustration and there's disappointment. And where that comes from is it's Aboriginal people constantly reaching out, providing cultural awareness, cultural understanding. If you look at the politicians who are trying to make it into a political situation, they have sat through numerous welcome to countries, acknowledgements of countries, respectfully. But all of a sudden, because it's an election, then it's something that can be leveraged to build a profile to gain votes or whatever it may be. So the disappointment comes from that because these people will have the opportunity to explain and to clarify the misunderstanding that is in the community. When you see some of the comments that are coming through, we don't need to be welcome to our own country. All of our leaders and politicians, and they know exactly what a welcome to country is and what an acknowledgement of country is. They have the power, they have the means to explain it and to clarify it. But instead, yeah, they just decide to use it as some sort of political game. Yeah, so the difficulty is getting caught up in it all, but certainly finding strength in your community is the way forward. Knowing that there are good things that are happening, there is people that who are strong in their identity and so on, and so I think that's the strength that they rely on to get them through some of these challenges. But it's nothing new. It's every so often these things come up. There was a saying before: if it's when you tune into radio or TV, if it's not the Aboriginals getting attacked, it's the Italians or somebody else or somebody else, or that's the history of our country. And but we have a lot to learn still, but a lot of that learning can be done by people in leadership today. And I think that's where the biggest letdown is. And that leadership is in all spaces. It's not just in the political space, it's in all spaces. And it's not for the Aboriginal people to keep educating and to keep telling and keep reminding. It's when our non-Aboriginal community stands up with us or on behalf of us, that's when the real education starts happening in our community.
Hmm. That was where I was going to be heading, I guess, with my next question. This concept of the next generation.
Mm.
How do you think non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people can maybe share with their children or help to break down within their own family
Yeah.
some of the prejudice, some of the barriers against Aboriginal
Mm.
people? Like, what does that look like? Not just, I guess, for what can we do as individuals, but what can we do to ensure that generationally things slowly will start to change in this country?
Yeah, look, I think we've got to understand that we are moving through history. And because of that, there are things that we might have didn't, said, or believed. And today we realize that may not have been the healthiest way or the right way or what it's. I think about my own background growing up where if you were gay, you were looked down upon, you frowned upon. And we had all the words in our community that we would say to describe what that was like. And I grew up with family members who were involved in that section of the community. And I heard all the stuff that you shouldn't say about them. And that was normal growing up. But as time goes on, you realize, you learn, you understand that's not the way that we treat or even speak about people. And so it's adjusting, educating ourselves, it's adjusting to those changes. We're able to do that for sections of our community, like the LGBT and so on community, that we just need to transfer that over with the Aboriginal community now. And as we move through time, the things that will reflect back where these things aren't really an issue because we simply see the value in it today, that because we're all part of the same society and everybody's valued in that society. So that's where I see us heading with it all. And that's the kind of change that needs to happen. So when we'll get there, I don't know. We take huge steps forward and then huge steps backwards. But I think as time goes on, it's becoming more and more evident that's where we're going to be heading.
Yeah, I relate to that. I think I wrote a piece at one point in my career about some of those ideas. I remember there were a lot of jokes around about Aboriginal people when I was at primary school and places like that. And I would tell them or laugh at them or share them on with other people. And then just had this point in my life where I realized, that was really non-productive, very hurtful, propagating stereotypes that aren't true. And I had to have that moment of confession and repentance going, hey, that was wrong. That was really the wrong thing to do. And I can now encourage my children not to take part or not to have those things repeated at home. Some of the stereotypes, some of the things we see on television or anywhere else, using those as opportunities to help my children avoid those pitfalls. It's easy to say, well, we were just doing it because everyone else was doing it. But at some point, you have to break the cycle of some of those unhelpful things.
And that's why truth telling is, we talk about voice, truth, and treaty. The truth telling part is so important. The whole fallout from the referendum, some were saying maybe we should have had the truth telling before it. And because we don't understand our own history, we don't understand, we're not at a point where we actually value. We value one another for who we are yet. And so that's why that's so important, that truth telling. But yeah, that's something we've got to learn. But I see the parallels with how we've come through society that way and where we need to be today with our understanding of Indigenous people.
Speaking of history, I suppose, just to move the conversation along, the Seventh-day Adventist Church that you're a part of, a minister for, it's done a lot of good things in the space, but it's also not perfect. It's not been perfect. There's some stuff that's been difficult in the history of the church that has had to be worked through. But on the flip side of that, do you think the Adventist Church has a special message for Indigenous people? I'm happy for you to cover, if you want to say anything about the imperfections and the struggles, but on the flip side, what are some of the pros, the positives that you can see that the church can really actually help and lift up Indigenous folks?
Yes, certainly we have a strong history together, the church working with Aboriginal people, and working for and working with, and is all tied up in that, where we've had missions. Those missions were set up in an era where government influence was there, and the churches were part of that, rightly or wrongly. That was just the era it was. Within those situations, there were individuals that were very genuine, much loved and respected. To this day, people still talk about different individuals very affectionately in how they ministered. And then there were others who took opportunity to do the wrong thing, and they've left their mark as well. So we've got that history, and there's nothing we can do about that today. It's happened. The graciousness of our Aboriginal people has always been there, and that's quite a testament to their love and appreciation for God and for the gospel message that they received in that process. I guess what the church has to offer Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today is really hope for a future, knowing that God is in control and that God redeems people, and that His second coming, His kingdom, where grace and love abounds, is something that Aboriginal people long for, because they haven't always experienced that here. And so therefore it's something that we would like to experience. Yes, we're hopeful of that. But at the same time, that can be achieved today, and should be achieved today the moment we step into a church or we step into a community, a faith community. That should be there. And so there's opportunity for that. We could probably do a lot better in that space today to make that a reality. But in saying that, the church really is something that we all need, a faith community. We all need to belong somewhere in the context of our beliefs and living them out. Not everybody can be a Seventh-day Advent and live in their own Aboriginal community and practice that. There is persecution. There is individuals who struggle with that simply because of the communal element within the Aboriginal context. So it makes it very difficult for them to express their faith and live out that. There is the church that could do a lot more in terms of adding value to Indigenous people. And we see that through our own ATSIM work. We do that. And it's, for us, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Ministries Department of the Church. It's really about taking people from our communities and introducing them to church, to the church community, and becoming part of the broader Adventist identity, the worldwide church. And so we see ourselves as mediators for that to happen, because a lot of our folk are living in Australia, not necessarily tuned into the world church and what's happening. And so we've got that opportunity to do that. And we think that also helps with gaining a better perspective of us as a collective faith group throughout the world. Part of a worldwide church does something for you, especially if you're living in a small town where you might see the pastor every 3 months or 6 months if you're lucky. We have got a lot to gain through that, and I think that's some of the really important things that our church has to offer to Indigenous people. And then even for those that are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living in cities, very busy lives and involved in all kinds of things in the community, we know that the faith message that we have is a good message. It's a balanced message. It's something that gives people hope, and it helps them to rise to their fullest potential. So that's where I see us as a church. We're able to give that, and that's exciting to see, and we're seeing that a lot. You only got to take stories out of Mumarafa College. It's probably one of our biggest success stories as a church, where we've got people coming to the college, and Mumarafa, the word itself, Mumarafa, God restores, God makes whole. That's what it's all about, and we see that happening in individuals' lives. And then when they are transformed, their households are transformed, their communities are transformed, and that's something that's God's kingdom here on earth today. And as a church, that's what we have to offer. That's where we live in, or making our mark in the Aboriginal community.
We have readers from all over, both the faith community, the non-faith community, and all sorts of different ethnicities, etc. What's one message that you'd like to leave with our readers as they're reading this issue, potentially thinking about NAIDOC, thinking about Indigenous thought issues and needs, etc.? What's something you'd like to encourage them with or leave them to think about?
Yeah, what I'd say to encourage is that historically Aboriginal people have been leaning in or crossing the line to to learn to understand what we would say the white fellas' ways. And whether it's language, education, you name it, employment, all of those aspects of life, Aboriginal people have been doing that, crossing the line or crossing the room to understand that, to be part of that. Yet we haven't seen that from the rest of the community doing the opposite, crossing the line to step over there, to understand. Like I say before, we can say hello in Japanese or in the German language, but we don't know the actual local Aboriginal language. And so we know stuff from overseas more than what we know what's in our own country, simply because we haven't crossed the room to have those conversations. And I think that's the more we do that as a broader community, the better we will be for as a society, and the more that we value one another as a society. And that's what it takes to be a thriving community, is when we know and we understand one another. And we're going to do things differently. We're going to do things that may appear to, that's not my way of doing it. And that's okay. But certainly when we work together a lot more close and we have a lot more understanding of one another, we'll see other things in our community be impacted in a positive way. And that's what we've got to gain. We've got all that to gain. And the more we keep drawing lines in the sand and pointing out the negatives, that actually won't help us to progress into that place.
Wow. It's a vision for a better future together.
Yeah.
I really like that idea and some of the thoughts you've shared today, Darren. I really appreciate you spending this time helping us to understand NAIDOC a bit better.